Enterprise Edition, convert RAC to a single instance database. Or they also have you, help you with a thing called SEHA, high availability on standard edition. But those are some of your options, but you really have a few more, and there's a few things we'll be talking about as we move forward. But first of all, why RAC? The real deep dive into why RAC is a different talk, and I've not that I think I actually presented at NYOUG about a year ago, but anyway, we do have a talk where we go into a lot more detail on that, or you can call us and get a hold of your Quest sales rep, and I can come out and talk to you or your company about what's going on with RAC and why you might want to use RAC, and why you might want to use some other things to also complement RAC. Major uses for RAC, HA, I think everybody knows about that one, high availability. You have one RAC instance kind of backed up by another, and you can actually fail over between them automatically. We'll cover that in some more detail. Workload isolation, that's another great case. If you've got a engine doing a lot of queries, you want to isolate those and keep those on a separate instance of Oracle. You can do that. You can tune that instance a little bit. You can't tune it completely. Some things have to stay the same, like block size and some of the underlying database attributes, but you can use it for workload isolation, and also for DR. A lot of people use RAC for DR. They have it either in a separate part of the data, have another server in a separate part of the data center, or in a connected but isolated environment, or they kind of bury their heads in the sand a little bit and figure, well, it's not likely to have a disaster that's going to take out our entire data center, and we'll cover that and cover some of the things that why that might not always be a prudent thing to do. And you've just still got a single point of failure as well in the database. We'll talk about that in some detail. And then finally, extreme scaling. Not with standard edition, but when you get up in enterprise edition and some of those things, you can get some really, really large environments by using RAC to scale out horizontally and move your workload around. So those are some of the common use cases for RAC. So let's talk about HA in a little more detail. With RAC, you've got a very, very quick failover. With scan listeners, you define a couple of listeners, and if the first node fails, the second node is going to step right in. It's already there, it's up and running, and all your users just shift over to the other node. You get all the workload features. Your users are going to see a short interruption or pause, but they're not going to lose any data. They're not going to see any loss of information or transactional integrity. It's almost seamless. The app itself is still going to connect and disconnect, and to make that completely seamless, you have to work real closely with WebLogic and some of the other pieces to make that happen. But you've still got a single point of failure, and that's the database, right? If that database fails, which can happen. When I was in a major bank, we had a frame power short, the power supply in a EOC frame shorted to ground, and that took out the entire frame, which of course took out the redundant storage and all of the clusters and so on, and took us off the air for a while. So you can have still single points of failure, and that single point of failure in a RAC environment is the database. So make sure you bear that in mind, that you're not getting complete fault isolation and fault tolerance. You're just getting some very good fault tolerance, but it's not complete, and there are other things you might want to do. Good news is there's also lots of alternatives to RAC if you want to do some things with a little bit less cost and a little differently. You can do OS clustering or other things that we'll talk about in some more detail as we move along here. Workload isolation. Again, scalability. Back in my DBA days, I worked for a telecom provider, and we actually had a data collection system where we had a two-node RAC. One side of the RAC collected the data, the other side of the RAC passed the data along to another third-party billing system, and that worked out very well. We had that tuned so it actually one node read and the other node, one node wrote the data and the other node read the data from separate sectors on the disks, and we did some very extensive tuning to make that happen, but those are the kinds of things you can make happen. It can be like a second instance of Oracle. Of course, you're paying for it. You're still paying Oracle for the privilege of using RAC and for the privilege of that second instance. And if you do it correctly, you're going to avoid the dreaded block pinging. Oracle has done a lot to improve that in the last releases of their product, and in 10.12c in particular, they did a lot to RAC to make it more efficient and less likely to ping or move blocks between environments. Block pinging essentially is a situation where you have instance one writes a block and updates it and keeps it pinned, and then instance two needs to look at the block. For some reason, they have to read the block from disk or read it from a rollback segment and get it to you that way. So, and then that can take time because you're moving data across the network. So the other piece that you want to make sure you do in RAC is have a high-speed interconnect between your two environments or your servers. And again, that database is still a single point of failure. You still got a single disk file that, or set of disk files that can be a point of failure if you're not not close and then not paying attention to that. Workload isolation is probably the best case for going ahead and moving to Enterprise Edition or Cloud, or if you've got some other things you want to take advantage of, if you've just plain outgrown your RAC environment, or you need to use some other features like partitioning or tuning and diagnostics, although Quest has another answer for that. Come talk to us if you're in a 19C environment and you're in Standard Edition and don't want to buy tuning and diagnostic pack. Come talk to us. We'll talk to you about Foglight and some of our other products that can help you out there. But as I say, this is probably the best case for saying, okay, we'll go ahead and bite the bullet and pay Oracle and move to either the cloud or a Enterprise Edition to get that workload isolation and have the ability to move workload around if you need to. So, okay, let's talk about HA and DR for a minute. Again, RAC is primarily used for HA, but some customers also use it for semblance of a DR environment. It's actually a shop that did that for a while. So what's the difference? HA is a system that you're going to build that ensures a higher than usual level of operational ability. So usually that's uptime, right? You don't want to have a server failure. You don't want to have something happen to a network or some sort of connection. So you build RAC or a cluster to make that happen. Now, DR, on the other hand, is a set of policies and procedures. DR is much more focused on, not what happens if a single server fails, but what happens if your entire data center fails. You have a fire, you have a power outage, you have some other incident that takes out your entire data center or at least a large piece of it, and now you have no place to host your data as well as to everything else you've got to worry about. So the key words there and the key things to talk about and differentiate are system and organization. Your business isn't going to stay running if your database is available, but your network isn't, or if you can't ship goods because your building was burned to the ground. So you've got to pay attention to a lot more in DR, and you start talking about things other than just availability and instantaneous things when you talk about HA and DR. And the key here is to discover and manage your users' expectations. I was actually in an environment and had to help the CIO explain, after we did have a flood in our data center, why that we couldn't recover the business in less than a day. We had to actually move to a standby data center, and why we lost a bunch of data on that, because the CIO had let the business believe that we had a much more robust DR program than we actually had. And here, the first point there, If your business is expecting a 5-second outage and your HA solution takes 30 minutes to move your data from one server to another because you're using standard clustering. We'll talk about that when we talk about SEHA, but that could be a career limiting event there. And then when you get into your disaster recovery, if your data center burns to the ground, how much data can you afford to lose? That's your recovery point objective. To what point in time am I going to be able to restore my data? With RAC and some good backups, could be instantaneous or close to that. Committed data is going to be there. If you're using Data Guard and maybe not using maximum protection Data Guard, you could be looking at however long it took to do the last log switch to do that. And then how long is it going to take you to recover if you can't occupy your building? That's your recovery time objective. And of course, all of this costs money, right? You can build a highly available system and take into a point all sorts of single points of failure and have redundant everything. I've been in organizations where they literally had a data center with redundant backup generators, one on each end of the data center, and redundant power supplies, redundant power distribution units, redundant switches, redundant servers, the whole 9 yards. But that can cost a lot of money, and you're usually going to have hardware sitting around idle or not as busy as it could be as you do that. Bottom line here, the 6 Ps, proper prior planning prevents pretty poor performance, and you can substitute other adjectives as you want there. But again, the idea there is you want to make sure you plan and understand and manage your user expectations so you know what you're getting into and what's happening. All right, so now back to 19C. Let's get comfortable with that disruption and that change and see what we can do in place of it. Then we're going to get creative. We're going to figure out how we're going to survive this change away from RAC. So again, standard edition, we're saying goodbye to RAC, but what are we going to do instead? And contrary to what Oracle is telling you, you do have a few choices. You can do without. If you were using RAC for a little bit of scalability or maybe high availability, but you discover that, okay, your users really can do without that level of availability. You only thought you needed it. Maybe you can save yourself some money and just say, oh, okay, we're not going to bother with RAC anymore. We're going to go down to standard edition and deal with that. You can throw money at the problem and buy Enterprise Edition. That's easy enough to do. All that takes is a check to Oracle. You can use what Oracle calls SEHA, Standard Edition High Availability. You can move your data to the cloud, or you can talk about doing something else, using replication or some other form of copying to keep your data available. Let's talk about these in a little more detail here. Do without. You really need RAC in the first place. Can you back up and recover your data quickly enough? Can you maybe mount your disks on a non-production system and put them together? Way back when, in about 1995, maybe a little later than that, I was working in a large telco, and we were using Sequent hardware at the time, and Sequent had introduced clusters and was telling us how good clusters were and how great they were and so on. And one of our admins actually conned them out of their, and it was a con, he had to work at it, but he conned them out of their meantime between failure data for their server and also their experience with clusters. And what he discovered was that a single server with redundant disks and redundant power supplies was actually more reliable in a failure than their cluster offering, because what happened with the cluster offering most of the time was that you'd come to use it and the failover would fail for whatever reason, and then you'd be scrambling around in a failure condition trying to figure out why your failover failed. Another war story there, we worked with a client when I was in a consulting organization, and they wanted to do cluster failover. We had that set up. It took us 3 weekends, better part of a month, to get the scripting right and to get all the failover stuff done to the point where it worked. And because we actually had to test it. We tested it on the production environment because the only place you can test failover really. Otherwise, you're going to be testing in a different environment. So we tested and we tested and we tested. Went away on the 3rd weekend. It had worked. We had a couple of tweaks we thought we'd make next weekend. Came in the following Monday morning after we'd done all that, and went into the server room, and one of the servers was completely dark, no lights on it, nothing blinking at all. Went out on the floor where the users were and asked, did they notice anything? What happened? Oh yeah, about 2 o'clock in the morning, we noticed that things got slow for a minute, and sure enough, they'd had a failure, and the cluster failover had taken place and worked. But again, that was essentially the 4th test we'd made to make that happen. So lots of things you need to do if you're going to start doing that kind of a recovery operation. And again, you want to consider your expectations. How long is it going to take to recover? How much data loss are you going to have? How much is downtime going to cost you? If you're an online retail organization, your downtime is going to be a lot more expensive, both in terms of lost sales and lost opportunity, than if you're a 8 to 5 accounting shop where all you're using your system for is accounting. That's another good point too. You don't need high availability and RAC or clusters for all of your environments. Again, if you got an 8 to 5 accounting operation, they can probably be down for a few hours while you move disks or find another system or do some of those things. Whereas, again, your online commerce, your e-commerce operation needs to be up 7 by 24. And basically, you're looking at a risk equation. You can do all sorts of statistics if you want and make some things that, but at the end of the day, it's all about risks and it's all about the cost of doing that. And you also want to make sure you consider management and maintenance of those things. Your cluster is going to cost a lot to maintain and manage than a single instance of Oracle. Even in your RAC environment, you're going to need to keep the pieces together, keep them updated at the same step, make sure things are working, and then again test your failover. So that's got some costs associated with it. Enterprise Edition, that's your next choice. Pay Oracle, run some scripts, you're done. Now you're using RAC, and you've got access to all the other cool features in Enterprise Edition, and you can use those for whatever you might want to do as well. So those are some of the other things that you can work with and do. And all you really need to do, somebody here, is as I say, just pay Oracle. You're going to need more management. Enterprise Edition is more management intensive. You'll probably have OEM and some other pieces you'll need to maintain, and just got more knobs and bells and whistles to work with. Again, if you need it, you need it. Great, go for it. But if not, you can stay without it and do without it. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Still got a single point of failure, the database, so you need to worry about that. And you're still not going to get true DR without additional costs. So Enterprise Edition may or may not actually meet your needs. SEHA, let's talk about that. Standard Edition, high availability. After Oracle announced the discontinuation of RAC back in January of 2020, there was a huge uproar. Nobody likes that. Nobody likes to lose features. Nobody likes to be told, oh yeah, you need to pay more for what you're getting, and that's not a good thing. So Oracle looked around and said, what can we do about that? How can we figure this out? How can we keep going? And they came up with SEHA. There's no migration. It's less expensive than Enterprise Edition, but all it really is under the covers is the old OS cluster cluster that we know and love from, again, back in the 1990s. I was playing with this stuff back in the 1990s. It requires clusterware and ASM. It's got longer failovers because now you have to unmount the disk. You have to figure out you've failed unmount the disks, mount them on the other system, move all your users to the other system, and so on. Still no DR, still a single point of failure of those disks. And at the end of the day, it's just OS clustering. Now, it's great if that's all you want and that's all you need. SEHA is definitely an option, and it's something you can take a look at and do. What about the cloud? Again, that's another talk. We definitely have some considerations there, something you can do there. You might also save some money. Oracle right now is pretty heavily discounted in cloud, and also, some of the pay-as-you-go options can be very attractive and very easy to work with. You can provide both HA and DR there. A lot of that kind of comes with the territory. You've got cloud backups, multi-regions, all sorts of things you can do to facilitate failovers and high availability. And if you want to go with Oracle's autonomous cloud, that's great for most cases. Autonomous transaction processing, autonomous data warehouse, and the analytics, some of those things. So if you're leaning in that direction anyway, maybe this is that disruption and that thing that pushes you over the edge and into that environment. Oracle, Azure, AWS, whichever one of the cloud vendors you pick. That's that can be a great way to go. That can move a lot of your business. But maybe you're a hospital or some other organization running some data that you don't want to put in the cloud for whatever reason, or your data needs to be close to your users, a manufacturing operation, or your data needs to be close to your shop floor. So cloud's not going to be right for everybody. Costs are hard to compare. Very, very difficult to compare, because if you start trying to compare across different cloud platforms, although we have a product that can help you out in that respect, come talk to us about Foglight Evolve, and we'll show you how you can figure out whether you're best utilizing some of those things. Bottom line, it's not free, but it may or may not be a cost benefit, but you need to look into it and make sure you're going into that with eyes open. It's most definitely a project to move from an on-premise environment into the cloud. So it's not like Enterprise Edition where all you have to do is pay Oracle. You're going to be doing a migration, having to move data, having to do some other things along the way. Pretty good if you don't want to get into the Enterprise Edition stuff. You want to still stay with Standard Edition. So it's a project that's going to cost you internally. And again, as I mentioned, you might have security and or access concerns. Again, come see us or talk to us about that, and we can give you more information on that. So let's talk about replication and possibilities around replication. The replication, you're going to get a second instance of your Oracle environment and HA and DR all in one, right? So the right solution's out there, and together we can help you find it, and you'll be able to work with it and do it. So next part of this is going to be talking specifically about SharePlex and about our product. So goodbye RAC, hello SharePlex. So what is SharePlex? Second instance of Oracle. It's open, read, write. You get workload isolation, you get rolling upgrades. We are a database and OS version agnostic, so maybe in addition to needing to upgrade from Oracle 12c to Oracle 19c in your main database environment, maybe you've got an application that can't tolerate an upgrade. The vendor says it works on 12c and it's not going to work on 19. How do you upgrade in that case? Well, you set up a second instance of Oracle running 12c, and you move your main data to 19, and then replicate the data you need for that little application back to your 12c environment. We can do that. We can help you do that. You get HA and DR all in one. You can now move your data from being in the same data center and being on the same tightly connected local area network to a WAN, maybe a data center across town, maybe data center in another part of the country, maybe the data center in another part of the world. There are some latency things you have to deal with when you start talking about that. But generally, there are no distance limitations with SharePlex, and you can have your data anywhere in the world. So you've got no single point of failure, no location limitations, and no recovery time. You don't have to stop the stop replication and move your data over, start the database, recover the database. It's open, read, write. It's available for you right away, and you can use it immediately. So how do we make that work? You've got some options. Easiest one is to set up a new 19C instance. That way you're going to start clean. You're not going to be running DBUA or any of the Oracle database scripts, so you're going to be able to start fresh and start with a brand new, clean version of 19C and all the nice features you've got, but nothing left over from the old environment. You're going to start with a consistent copy. You have to have a copy of your database to be able to start replication, and that's got to be consistent to a particular SCN or a particular point in time. You tell us how to make that work, and we'll help you to do that. You can also use one of the RAC nodes. As Oracle has told you and asked you to do, you take your node down, you set it up as a single instance, and then you've got no need for any additional copies. You can use DBUA to upgrade to your new 19C environment and then move your users over as you need to. So that's another way to get there and to get things started. So yep, you can also upgrade with SharePlex. Set up your second instance. We can do that with near zero downtime. Way we do that, I'll talk about in a few minutes. But this way, you're not having to take your users down and keep them down while you're doing your copy or your migration. No data loss. Your data is going to be consistent, so your users won't see any loss of data while you're doing your upgrade, and you've got the ability to do testing and fall back to your old environment. You know, if you do your upgrade and then you discover 2 days into it that, gee, this report that I had doesn't run right anymore because the optimizer is doing something I didn't expect, and we need to fall back. We need to go back to the old version. Well, we set up SharePlex and use reverse replication, replicating from the new environment back to the old environment. You've got your data that you entered in the new environment replicated back to the old, and you can go on from there. And again, there you are. So here's the SharePlex architecture. We'll talk about that in some detail here. And if you want to drop a question in the meeting chat, go ahead and feel free to do that as well. I can answer some questions on the way while we're going here. We start out with a capture process that reads the data, puts it in a capture queue, move on to read. Read's kind of a traffic cop. Read will decide if I'm making multiple copies or moving from one environment to another, what things I want to replicate if I don't want to replicate my entire schema. Move the data across the network using export and import. That's not Oracle's export import. That's our own proprietary software that just moves data across. And then on the target side, we post the data into the target database using SQL. And that target can be in the cloud, it can be on-prem, it can be literally anywhere you want it to be. And then we have the multiple lines here indicate that we can have multiple post queues, so we can take advantages of parallelism and make things go a little faster than they wanted to. So that's the SharePlex architecture in a nutshell. Some resources for you here. Quest happen to high availability in Oracle 19C. Better way for HADR and 19C standard edition. We've covered a lot of that. Some testimonials from other companies that are using SharePlex and the SharePlex product itself. And that concludes the presentation. If anybody has any questions, again, either raise your hand and I can unmute you, or if you want to put something in the chat, meeting chat, we can have a discussion here for a little while. And if you've got questions, you come up later and you think about something, feel free to drop us a line. We will be making the slide deck available through NYOUG, and as Sherry said earlier, we'll have we'll do a drawing after the event, and someone will come away with a gift card. Any questions? Not seeing anything here. Again, raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. All right. Well, thank you all very much for attending, and on behalf of Quest and NYOUG, thank you again, and hope to see you at another presentation, and hopefully before too much longer, we'll be back together gathering in person. We do have a question here. Yeah, contact information. Let's go back to that. I'll go back to the previous slide and show that again. There's the resources if you want to take a screenshot of that, or again, it'll be on the slide deck that the NYOUG will be publishing. So, all right. Well, thank you all very much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Clay. Thanks, everyone.